Thanks for tuning in. You're watching Gravitas. Now, in this segment, we talk about our guests on what happens in case US does decide to renegotiate or do away completely with NAFTA, and what would a SAARC look like without India. Joining us on the show tonight is Pramit Pal Chaudhary. He's the Foreign Affairs Editor with the Hindustan Times. Joining us from Brookings Institute, Washington, D.C., Senior Fellow Josh Meltzer. Thank you so much for joining us. Also joining us from the newsroom is our Senior International Correspondent, Ramesh Ramachandran. Before that, let's get you this story. Now, despite Donald Trump's fulminations, NAFTA is booming. The same cannot be said of SAARC, though, which is more than 30 years after it was established, is characterized by low levels of trade, connectivity, even cooperation. Ramesh Ramachandran has this report for you.
While the jury is still out on whether the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP will survive after Trump vowed to pull the US out of the regional free trade agreement, the winds of change blowing across North America and parts of Europe have cast the spotlight on similar experiments in South Asia. Unlike the TPP, which was signed earlier this year, the South Asian Free Trade Area, or SAFTA, is over a decade old, but it has not met with much success.
SAFTA was one track on which things could have moved, but Pakistan has no use for SAFTA. So, as Foreign Secretary is absolutely right that you cannot. This is deceiving yourself and deceiving the region.
Mutual distrust has taken a toll on trade within South Asia.
For instance, SAARC itself, its overall accumulated trade under SAFTA is a pittance. But still, looking at the overall situation, it would be something like $3 billion in the last 10 years, ever since SAFTA entered into force. Much of it is between India and Bangladesh, because other countries have a bilateral trade which is much faster.
As Trump mulls renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, Sharma fears that the virus of protectionism might spread to the rest of the world and bring with it unanticipated problems and heighten anxieties.
If the cohesion and the strength of the Western system goes down, for the rest of the world, what is the reigning mantra? Certainly not the Chinese Confucianism, which is neither here nor there. And so always the world of ideas is determined by some prevailing doctrine, some prevailing trends. And what will that trend be, it is difficult to envisage.
How South Asia negotiates this challenge will depend a lot on how India chooses to respond to the situation. Brexit and now Trump's decision to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership have cast a long shadow on countries around the world, including South Asia. The future of regionalism is in doubt as the US and the UK turn protectionist, isolationist, and insular. But more importantly for India, the United States' deliberate retreat has catapulted China into playing a more influential role in the region and beyond. And that is likely to keep Indian policymakers awake at night. Ramesh Ramachandran, WION, New Delhi.
Well, NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Area, brings together Canada, the United States, as well as Mexico, and it is one of the world's largest free trade zones. Now, the purpose was to eliminate trade barriers and facilitate cross-border movement of goods and services. It was the brainchild of the late President Ronald Reagan. NAFTA promotes conditions of fair competition. It also increases investment opportunities. It provides protection and enforcement of IP or intellectual property rights. It also creates procedure for the resolution of trade disputes, and NAFTA also establishes a framework for further trilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation.
Now, that was NAFTA. Let's give you a sense of what the SAARC is all about. The South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation was established back in 1985. It brings together the 8 nations of Southern Asia in a regional arrangement that's focused on political and economic cooperation. SAARC also seeks to build on common cultural links and promote greater people-to-people contact. Briefly, SAARC's objectives are to accelerate economic growth and social progress, to promote and strengthen collective self-reliance among the countries of this region, also to contribute to mutual trust and understanding, along with strengthening the cooperation among themselves in international forums on matters of common interest, and lastly, cooperation with international and regional organizations with similar aims and purposes.
All right, now let's go to Dr. Josh Meltzer in Washington, D.C. with the Brookings Institution to talk about NAFTA specifically. Now, at this point, it's a wait-and-watch game, but what are some of the implications at this point if the United States comes out and gives that warning to Canada and Mexico, says, we're done with NAFTA, we're not interested in this? What are some of those global implications, even for some of the countries in North America?
Look, if the Trump administration was to actually go down that pathway, there would be some pretty serious negative trade and economic implications for the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Canada and Mexico are the largest trading partners of the United States. They buy more goods and services from US exporters than any other country. There is deep integration of supply chains between these three countries, and there is a lot of jobs and opportunity which depends on the reasonably free flow movement of goods, services and peoples between the United States, Canada and Mexico. So, you would see a lot of economic disruption if this was the path that the Trump administration decided to pursue.
All right. Also, very quickly, Dr. Meltzer, do you think this is feasible? You yourself mentioned some of the points that it's going to be difficult to bring, in order to bring the jobs back to America. In the long term, do you think it's going to see more jobs going out?
Look, first thing, I don't think we're going to see a Trump administration walking away from NAFTA. In fact, the signals over the last couple of days are that they want to renegotiate NAFTA.
That's right.
And so I think the basic framework and the basic economic links will remain. There is Mexico was a target during the campaign as being, for a variety of reasons, but certainly one of them was on the implications of trade with Mexico for manufacturing jobs in the United States, China as well. The US manufacturing sector is in fact in good health. The reality of it has been that increasingly the share of jobs in manufacturing has been declining, and this has been the case for 30, 40 years.
Right.
There was certainly a large decline in the 2000s. Some of it was trade, but most of it was productivity and technology. So a lot of these low-paying, low-skilled jobs are not going to come back to the United States.
All right. Dr. Meltzer, I request you to please stay on with us. Those were very valid points that you made, but talking about SAARC, looking it through the prism of NAFTA, let's say, there's a lot of disharmony happening in the region as well. What is the future of SAARC? What if India decides that it does not want to be with SAARC anymore because, the trade is not so great?
Well, SAARC itself is essentially a political organization. It's driven not by trade, that's a subset of what it wants to do, but it's really about a political arrangement between these countries. So SAARC will remain what it is, a political organization that has not gone very far because the two biggest members, Pakistan and India, are perpetually at loggerheads. And the South Asian preferential trade arrangement, which is part of that, has also not gone ahead, partly because of these two countries, but also because India has not been a particularly good partner on supporter of free trade. But what India has done under the Modi government has concluded that since Pakistan is such an issue, and they do want to move forward, as you mentioned, on connectivity and on trade and investment, they will then use BIMSTEC, which is essentially a Bay of Bengal organization, incorporates all the members of SAARC minus Afghanistan and Pakistan, plus Thailand and Myanmar, and use that as effectively the new trade organization.
But you said it's political, it does not have to do with trade. That's a very valid point, of course, but then it becomes inconsequential after a point because... It'll
drift for a while, but it won't mean India will pull out of SAARC. SAARC has drifted before. Every time India and Pakistan have gone to war or have been fighting, SAARC has basically been paralyzed, right? So SAARC is an organization that goes through long periods of drift. I mean, that's basically, it's drifted more often than it's actually been active. So that's not a surprise as far as SAARC is concerned. But BIMSTEC is now where the Indian government will focus. And in fact, because it now incorporates Nepal, Sri Lanka,
a lot of the countries already.
Everybody in SAARC except for two countries.
Right.
Therefore, it can go ahead and do this. And the real issue is going to be connectivity. The Asia Development Bank and others have shown that the real problem in South Asia is not tariffs or non-tariff barriers. It's simply a lack of roads and rail links. That even if the tariff barriers are low, you can't move the containers through fast enough, that lines of trucks at every border post and so on. And that's where BIMSTEC, so the government of India is still interested, like the difference in Modi and Trump is Modi still wants to promote the trade. He's just using a different venue or a different system to do it, because he realizes the politics between India and Pakistan doesn't allow him to use SAARC.
But when we talk about, NAFTA and SAARC specifically, NAFTA about 22 years old, SAARC now much older, 32. With the United States, if they decide to opt out, that is a little bit of a different equation because of all the jobs when it comes to manufacturing, and consumers could directly see an impact right there in the United States because of the three countries, Canada, US, and Mexico. But on the other hand, when we talk about SAARC and SAFTA and many of these other entities, these regional groups with India, BIMSTEC, all these other groups, there's so many, not just one. So will the impact be a little bit different? Because, hey, if they don't do SAARC, there's a couple of others that they can fall into.
Yeah, well, I think as has been mentioned, as Professor Meltzer mentioned, the integration of the supply chains between Mexico, Canada, and the United States is so deep. The maquiladora plants on the borders of Mexico are effectively American, a lot of them are American companies, which are then putting together stuff and then selling it in the United States. We don't have a similar situation in India. The degree of economic integration between India and Bangladesh, for example, is actually very weak. Until recently, a ship leaving Calcutta could not dock in Bangladesh. It had to go via Singapore to dock because we didn't even have an arrangement for direct shipping between the two countries. That just changed a few years ago. So we don't have anything like that kind of supply chain integration. In fact, to be fair, in India, the supply chain integration within India is pretty bad. So therefore, SAARC is a much, much weaker organization in terms of South Asian trade. And in fact, if tomorrow SAARC was to completely disintegrate, probably would barely notice, frankly.
It wouldn't be as much of an economic impact as
at all, exactly.
All right, let me go back to Dr. Joshua Meltzer, who's been patiently waiting for us. Thank you so much. Coming back to you once again, we're talking about renegotiating NAFTA under Trump administration. What, according to you, are the changes that he might be looking at in order to restructure NAFTA in its present form?
Look, it's difficult to say at this point. We don't have many details to go on. Some of the issues that have come up during the campaign and other issues which have been mentioned briefly since he was elected have been around this idea of rules of origin, so the amount of domestic content that is required in order to take advantage of the lower tariffs getting into the United States, for instance. One of the concerns that he talked about repeatedly with regard to the TPP, for instance, was that low rules of origin would allow countries like China to essentially inject some inputs into other countries in the TPP and in essence then take advantage of the lower tariff rates. And so we might see some renegotiation around the rules of origin, though the ones in NAFTA, certainly if you look at, say, around automotives, are high, and they're in the 60% range and higher than what was ultimately agreed to in the TPP, and so we'll see what can be done there. There's been some discussion possibly around the so-called investor-state dispute settlement mechanism under NAFTA, which allows investors from one of the three countries to go to international arbitration to challenge whether a country is complying with its investment commitments under the agreement. There's been some talk about how this is unfair and it gives investors undue judicial rights and the like, so we may see some movement on that front.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, let's go now to Ramesh Ramachandran in our newsroom. Ramesh, let's talk about, the situation with SAARC specifically in India. We see many of the countries deciding to opt out of this year's summit in Islamabad. Certainly, unlike the United States, there are many other regional economic groups, as we've mentioned, including BIMSTEC. Why do we think that Pakistan is holding SAARC ransom?
Indeed, Archie, just to take off from the point where Pramit left, we're already seeing a rethink on the part of many of the countries in the region. Pramit mentioned BIMSTEC, but we're also seeing sub-regional cooperation or minilateralism, as it's called, between Bangladesh, India, Bhutan, and Nepal, called for the BBIN connectivity project. On the western frontier, for instance, because of Pakistan's intransigence, we are seeing a cooperation, a trilateral cooperation between and among India, Afghanistan, and Iran for the Chabahar port and the road overland connectivity onwards to Afghanistan. On the eastern frontier, again, we have a trilateral highway between India, Myanmar, and Thailand. Also, not to mention the BCIM corridor, which links Bangladesh, China, India, and Myanmar. And these were the sentiments which were expressed by the Indian Foreign Secretary S. Jaishankar yesterday at a conference here in New Delhi, where he sort of aired or amplified New Delhi's or the government's sentiments by saying that Pakistan, without naming the country, of course, that some members need to introspect, need to rethink, need to revisit their positions insofar as SAARC and regional cooperation is concerned, because SAARC in its present form will not survive for long in its present form if the situation continues forever. Archit?
All right, I request you all gentlemen to please stay on with us. Let's have a closer look at what SAARC is all about. Now, the 8 SAARC member states meet to talk about economic growth, social justice, and they promote stability. But just recently, India, Bangladesh, along with Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan pulled out of the SAARC meet in Islamabad. So what are the implications if any country pulls out? Here's a report.
SAARC represents about 20% of the world's population and about 10% of the world's economy. India is the largest by population with a GDP of about $2 trillion. It has a fairly sophisticated agricultural and industrial base and is a major exporter and investor overseas. Comparatively, its neighbors are small, with low levels of industrialization and small export baskets. All have borders with India, but not with each other. So India pulling out of SAARC will matter little to India, since sub-regional transport and trade networks are already developing, although slowly. So South Asian Free Trade Agreement signed in 2006 has made limited progress. SAARC also consists of several sub-regional economic groups. BIMSTEC, for example, brings together Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Bhutan, and Nepal, all in a sub-regional framework to push connectivity through transport, trade, and other links. Each country focuses on specific sectors, covering trade, transportation, energy, fishery, technology, public health, agriculture, and climate change. India focuses on tourism, terrorism, and environmental management. There's also the Mekong-Ganga Cooperation Initiative, which focuses on links with Southeast Asia. Archit Seshadri, WION.
All right, in fact, we've seen that report, but now we are discussing NAFTA parallelly with SAARC, two things which are very difficult to compare or be talked about in the same breath. But the fact remains that it is the Trump administration because of which we're discussing NAFTA, and we've seen India's aggressive stand ever since the Modi government has taken over. So it's rather appropriate to talk about the way these two leaders are working and shaping up the politics of the future, Donald Trump and Narendra Modi. Pramit, what do you have to say?
See, Modi is not opposed to trade. What he is not a great enthusiast for multilateral trade agreements, and he's continued the previous government's policies on fighting in the World Trade Organization. He's not been a great enthusiast for the RCEP. We've been a struggle there. But within the region, between the Indian Ocean and South Asia, he's a very strong supporter of trade. He believes that the integration of South Asia on trade and connectivity is absolutely crucial for India's long-term strategic and economic future.
Right.
So in that area, he's very different from Trump. Here is Trump saying that NAFTA, which is almost, nobody even in America even questions it anymore, it's just been part of their life for such a long time,
right.
That this has to be broken. So he actually wants to sever or change the economic relationship between the United States and its immediate neighbors, and which is the exact opposite of what Trump wants to do. I mean, what Modi wants to do.
Right.
So that's a very crucial difference between the two. And Modi's coming in with a very didn't campaign on an anti-trade platform.
Right.
Quite the opposite. His game was ease of doing business, pro-business position within his country, and the idea of India becoming more and more economically integrated with the rest of the world.
Going back to the question about the leaders and their vision, when you talk about Trump and Modi certainly, as you mentioned, not cutting the axis, but just perhaps limiting it. But Trump has made a lot of statements that have not necessarily been the extent of which he means. For example, repealing Obamacare. There's many things that he said. Do we also take this with a grain of salt? Do we, January 20th, early on, we have about 2 months before he actually steps in and is in front of the Oval Office. How realistic is something like this, or is this just a big war of words?
Traditionally, when a politician comes in on a protectionist platform, what he will look for is some symbolic concessions in return so that he can go back to his constituents and say, look, I've gotten this for you. And NAFTA, because it's so now deeply, the U.S. economy is so deeply integrated with the NAFTA structure, it's very hard for him to reverse this without causing enormous disruption in the U.S. economy. Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, is easy for him to dump because that hasn't even started yet. So he can easily kill that off, that it has no impact, zero impact economically because it doesn't exist yet. So it's very easy for him to kill off a few of these. NAFTA, as I said, he'll renegotiate. What that means is not clear, but my guess is he'll squeeze out a few minor concessions from Canada, more so from Mexico, and that'll be probably enough for him to go and say, look, I've done something on that front.
All right. In fact, let's quickly also take a look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which is now 22 years old. Canada and US started a free trade pact in 1989. 5 years later, NAFTA broadened the free trade to Mexico. It started in 1994 as one of the world's largest free trade zones, and it paved the foundation for strong economic ties between Canada, Mexico, and the US President-elect Donald Trump has talked about opting out of NAFTA or reorganizing it in some way. But what economic impacts could this mean for North America? We tried to find that out for you in this report.
Over the past 2 decades, NAFTA has shown how free trade increases wealth, market competitiveness, and helps families, farmers, manufacturers, and consumers. Under NAFTA, trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico has tripled. It's reached nearly $950 billion in 2008. Every day, the NAFTA partner exchange generates nearly $3 billion a day. So that's more than $100 million an hour. NAFTA has also helped create more than 40 million jobs in North America, a 23% increase since 1993. NAFTA has helped promote transparency, economic growth, and legal certainty. Since NAFTA came into effect, North America's economy has doubled. The combined GDP, or gross domestic product, for Canada, US, and Mexico has surpassed $17 trillion in 2008. That same year, Canada and the US's foreign investment stocks also went up to nearly $470 billion. Mexico became a growing, emerging market. The NAFTA region is home to 444 million people. 33 million live in Canada, 304 million live in the US, and the rest, 107 million, live in Mexico. The United States is one of the world's largest economies. They're also the world leaders when it comes to manufacturing, high-tech sectors including computers, medical equipment, aerospace, telecom, financial services, and agriculture. 1 in 5 jobs in Canada is linked to international trade, and free trade for Mexico has now modernized the country's economy. Their exports are now expanded from oil to manufactured products and make them one of the largest exporters in the world. NAFTA has also improved working conditions and helped labor rights, including pregnancy-based discrimination, protection contracts, and safety for migrant workers. NAFTA has also pushed for higher wages. Archit Seshadri, WION.
Dr. Meltzer, coming back to you now, I was reading up a research of 2014 that actually comes from the Economic Policy Institute. It found that NAFTA created trade deficits and resulted in 850,000 job losses between the time period of 1993 to 2013. Now, we've seen the kind of support that Trump's gotten, and there was a survey done very recently which says that most of America is looking forward to his term as president. How do you look at these developments in light of NAFTA and how things might just change for America in the days to come?
You know, certainly Trump's campaigned on a platform of a fairer deal for American workers. And I think, you know, taking that at its face value, there's a lot to support there. The challenge, of course, is making sure that the policies that follow are actually ones which are going to help those who feel that they've been left behind by not necessarily only globalization, but technology and just dynamic new economies, particularly in the United States. These trade agreements, whether we're talking about NAFTA or TPP or WTO, have on net benefited the United States, have benefited Canada, and have benefited Mexico. Everyone has always agreed that there are job losses, but there are overall job gains, which a lot of these reports fail to identify. The challenge, of course, is how do you have in place a set of policies, training, social safety nets and the like, which can actually help workers adjust to the difficulties and the change that is being brought about by a whole range of factors, including trade. The focus on closing down borders or renegotiating trade agreements is going to make differences at the margins, potentially negative differences. The hard work's actually going to be on getting the domestic policy settings right.
And Joshua, we're going to piggyback on that question with regards to NAFTA. What about for the average consumer? If Trump decides to rearrange it in some way, shape, or form, certainly many companies in the United States do business in Mexico. Some of the jobs in the manufacturing are there with companies like GM, IBM, Coca-Cola, to name a few. If there are tariffs, if there are other repercussions, the average consumer, the prices of certain goods could go up. What about other unforeseen sites? How will the average consumer be impacted if there is some sort of a revamp to NAFTA?
What I think a lot of people don't appreciate in the United States is how much their jobs are often tied to international trade. I mean, even if the company they're not working for is not itself an exporter, often they're providing inputs or other services to companies which themselves do trade. And in fact, you hear stories all the time about workers in plants that are direct exporters who don't realise that their livelihood often depends on access to other markets. So you would see, a lot of these flow-on effects going through the economy where export markets would become, more difficult. US products and services would become less competitive, and jobs in those sectors would shrink. The data shows that if you're actually working in an export-orientated sector, your wages on average are about 17% higher than if you're not. So, there's a lot of losses to be had for, these what are very good middle-class paying jobs.
All right, thank you for that update. We're now going next to Ramesh Ramachandran in our newsroom to provide us this perspective with regards to NAFTA. Ramesh, we spoke earlier about this, but if there are some issues, per se, with the United States and Mexico when it comes to a renegotiated NAFTA, what about implications to India? Could India bear the brunt of any of that? What type of impacts could we see right here, if any, in South Asia?
Archis, the implications for India are manifold on the economic front, the economic policy front, as well as on the geostrategic or geopolitical front. Now, the US decision to opt out of the TPP has shifted the focus, or will shift the focus, to the rival, as it were, regional trade pact piloted by China called the RCEP. Now, India is among the 16 members of the RCEP, and it remains to be seen how the other members of the RCEP, who are also members of the TPP, will take a position going forward. So that's on the economic front. On the geostrategic front, we've seen the Trump indicate as much that he might not be as interested in America's pivot to Asia as Obama has been. And that will have its own set of implications for India. The assumption here is that the US retreat on the economic and on the strategic fronts might give China that much more leeway to exert its influence in the region and beyond. And this is where I think Pramit might also want to come in. The implications for India, for Indian foreign policy makers, are profound.
Right, Pramit. Taking forward from what Ramesh is saying now, what happens now? We certainly know the automakers are really apprehensive about what's going to happen in Mexico, but what does it mean now? Changes in NAFTA, what does it mean for India?
Okay, well, NAFTA, we don't do that much trade yet with NAFTA, except for the United States and a bit with Mexico. But the issue for Mexico will be very interesting. Mexico and India have been looking at a deeper economic engagement now for the past 3 years. You saw Prime Minister Modi visited Mexico recently, which is the first time an Indian Prime Minister has visited Mexico in decades, as far as I know. And they've met not just once, but several times at the UNGA. We are now the third largest buyer of Mexican crude in the world. And the Mexicans have now begun coming to us and say, look, we are a major manufacturing country now, quite independent of our relationship with the United States. And your Make in India project is something that Mexico is prepared to work with. So we may have an interesting development. Volkswagen cars that are made in India are shipped, the bulk of them are shipped to Mexico. And we could now see a supply chain developing with India and Mexico and other Latin American countries, which until now has simply not existed. So a lot of these Latin American countries, especially if they think America is becoming hostile, and they need a place in Asia to develop, and they find China a very difficult place to do business, are now beginning to see India as a potential. And Mexico has actually been at the forefront of a lot of this exploration. And Canada is more of a resource-driven economy, but it's something, again, we've begun, and Indian companies are beginning to invest increasingly in Canada.
Right. So we really have to wait and watch what happens come January as far as NAFTA is concerned, TPP is concerned. That's for sure. America has decided to do away with it. But it's going to be interesting. Somebody's gain is going to be somebody else's loss and vice versa. Interesting times ahead. On that note, thanks so much, all of you, for joining us this evening. Pramit Pal Chaudhary there joining us with his perspective on this story. Also Dr. Meltzer, Ramesh Ramachandran there. Thank you all once again for joining us.
And that does it for this bulletin of Gravitas. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you'll join us next time. I'm Archit Seshadri.
Thanks so much for tuning in. You can watch all of our top stories, track them online on social, digital and mobile media platforms. Good night.